Good day, everyone. It is 1 minute to the hour. We are now live on Facebook, and this meeting is also being recorded. Thank you once again to everyone for joining us in today's event. Please note that this session is being recorded and is also being live streamed on Facebook. For those who have just joined us recently, we would greatly appreciate if you could rename yourself on Zoom to the following format that you see on screen. Depending on whether you identify as someone from the academe, from a government agency, from the private sector, or civil society, we would greatly appreciate you self-identifying, as this will be very important for the workshop later on. And as it is now exactly 4 o'clock p.m. Philippine Standard Time, I'd like to greet everyone good afternoon from the Philippines, to friends and guests, especially those who are joining us from other parts of the globe. My name is Daniel C. Ratilla, the focal point of the My Climate Risk Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, and I will be serving as your host and moderator for today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us here at an event hosted by My Climate Risk, or MCR, a lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program, which aims to develop and mainstream a bottom-up approach to regional climate risk. This year, the Ateneo Hub is happy to organize today's event with the MCR Education Working Group and the MCR University of Cape Town Hub. The Ateneo Hub has traditionally put out events under the series of Climate Voices on the Ground, Perspectives from Different Sectors, and Climate Research as if People Mattered. Climate Voices explored the different contexts and experiences of climate change, while climate research looked at how these different contexts and experiences are considered, and how we may apply these in research design and management. As we will see later on, today's event is actually a hybrid between these two series. We're also delighted to work with the Education Working Group, whose series in 2023, titled Can We Do Better? Climate Science and Colonialism, explored the connections between the two. Alongside us is the University of Cape Town Hub, which plans to host a webinar that looks at how responses to climate change might perpetuate patterns of discrimination and oppression, and opportunities to address these issues. We're very happy to work together across our different groups and find synergy. As a reminder of the nature of this event, this first half will include talks by our speakers and a panel discussion. This will be followed by a workshop that participants on Zoom will be invited to actively participate in through a series of breakout rooms. If appropriate, education materials and a perspective paper may be made from the insights. The workshop will not be available on the live stream, but our public audience can view once again once we return for the plenary. And we hope that everyone sticks around and becomes a part of the My Climate Risk community. Just some reminders before we start. Please note that the program is being recorded. On Zoom, all participants are muted automatically as they enter. Throughout the session, kindly type in any comments or questions in the chat. Participants on Facebook Live may also type in the comments section. And finally, there will be an evaluation at the end of the session. Requests for e-certificates may be made through the same form. At this point, we invite everyone to make the sign of their faith or join us in their own contemplation as we recite an interfaith prayer for our planet. May I become at all times, both now and forever, a protector to those without protection, a guide for those who have lost their way, a ship for those with oceans to cross, a bridge for those with rivers to cross, a sanctuary for those in danger, a lamp for those without light, a place of refuge for those who lack shelter, and a servant to all in need. For as long as space endures, and for as long as living beings remain, until then may I too abide to dispel the misery of the world. And now, to formally welcome everyone to today's session and to talk a bit more about MCR, I am honored to call on Dr. Theodore Shepard, co-chair of the My Climate Risk Lighthouse activity. Dr. Shepard, thank you as always for joining us.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, very good. Okay, so I just want to say a few remarks first about my climate risk, and Daniel's already mentioned our sort of official goal, which is develop and mainstream a bottom-up approach to climate risk, and that's, you might say, our scientific framing of the ambition. But as soon as you think about how you do that, that involves, we think, building robust methodologies which empower local communities and challenge the apparent objectivity of top-down approaches. And that's a very political agenda, I would say. And this is closely linked to a second aspect of our goal, I would say, which we didn't realize at the time when we set it up, but it's become very clear, is to build an ecosystem of communities of practice, especially in the global south. And Ateneo has been really a leader in that activity for us, and that's also a very political goal, you might say. And fairly quickly within MCR, Vandana Singh, who's a member of our steering group, um, realized that actually a lot of what we were doing was education, not in the traditional World Climate Research Program sense, which is generally about training, but actually a broader sense, I guess, in the spirit of Paulo Freire, that we're all educators in various ways when we speak to people outside of our communities, whether it's in the public or just another colleague or something. And we all learn from that engagement. It's a two-way process. And I would say also it links back to our two themes. You link theory and practice very closely. And so that's been a wonderful initiative that Vandana has led, and there's been a lot of engagement, especially from Ateneo. And the goal of the education group is to share our learning experience, and I'm very happy to be part of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shepard. Indeed, it has been a very interesting experience to see how much my climate risk has evolved throughout the years. It is
It is
now my
now my
pleasure
pleasure
to
to
introduce
introduce
our panelists for today. Our first panelist, our first panelist is
is
Dr.
Dr.
Rowena Azada-Palacios. She is a philosopher of education whose work lies at the intersection of decolonial political thought and education. Her book, Postcolonial Educational and National Identity, An Arendtian Reimagination, examined citizenship education practices through a decolonial lens, and she has written elsewhere on social justice in education and climate justice education. Apart from her post as an assistant professor of philosophy at the Ateneo de Manila University, she's currently a research fellow at the University of Edinburgh, where she is exploring the colonial roots of the research university and its knowledge production practices. Our second speaker is Ms. Alice McClure. She is an early career researcher who works broadly across fields of climate risk and adaptation, including on topics of inter alia learning, knowledge co-production, transformative adaptation, equity, and climate resilient development. She is particularly interested in human experiences of climate and weather and how these interact with other experiences of identity, place, and space, among other things. Alice's work is rooted in transdisciplinary praxis. She aims to contribute to a growing body of knowledge relevant to transdisciplinarity that focuses on and is generated in African contexts. Her thesis explores transdisciplinary learning for navigating complex African urban climate risks, centering on transformative agency of participants. Everyone, please join me in welcoming our two esteemed panelists, Dr. Azada-Palacios and Ms. McClure.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction, and I hope everyone can see my slides. Good. Okay, great. So, Good afternoon, morning, evening to everyone. And thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. So I'm just going to give a brief discussion of some of the theoretical ideas that have framed today's session. And so my presentation is titled Why Colonialism and Why Transdisciplinarity. So on your screen, you see a map of the world, color coded based on which empires these different countries have at one point belonged to. And this is what the world looked like in 1914. And you can see again the color coding of the map based on which parts of the world at that time were part of which empires. And this historical context lays the foundation for some of the theoretical developments around the concept of colonialism. So, as all of us know, after the Second World War, geopolitics changed. There was a wave of political decolonization after the Age of Empire, by which a lot of countries in what we today call the Global South became independent sovereign states. And in the wake of that, you had in the 1970s and the 1980s the emergence in Western, mostly literature. Sorry, was I mute? Was I? Okay, I received I received a note from a Fasi to unmute. But you heard the first part of my. Okay, good. Sorry about that. Okay, so a field which came to be known as post-colonial studies. And what at the risk of oversimplifying it, what many of these scholars were interested in were the ways that former colonies and people from the former colonies were represented in arts and literature, in Western arts and literature. And they were trying to correct these oversimplistic, often racist representations. Now, in the 1990s, in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union and in the wake of the collapse of a strong, like Marxist political movement around the world, some scholars in Latin America who were originally thinking along post-colonial lines began to develop what came to be known as the decoloniality movement. And what they were interested in was how colonialism shaped the power dynamics of global geopolitics and global knowledge production. And when we hear the word decolonial or decolonizing, oftentimes the people who are using these words are using these words according to the ways that these original seminal authors and thinkers in the decolonial movement um, um, conceptualize these ideas. So, just to briefly summarize some of the ideas that they came up with, the decoloniality movement took what you might call a world systems approach, which means that they weren't interested only in colonialism within specific states, regions, or geographic locations, but really how colonialism shaped the entire world. They argued that modernity was coloniality, meaning coloniality, okay, note the word coloniality rather than colonialism, which they understand to be the continuing legacy of colonialism, is the dark side of modernity. So the only reason why modernity and modernization happened was because of colonialism. It was the extraction of resources from the colonies, and the creation of racial hierarchies that allowed that allowed modernization to happen. They also took what might be called an epistemic turn in the sense that they argued that colonialism suppressed knowledges and created a hierarchy of knowledge systems, which was then used to suppress and subjugate different peoples around the world. And they were focused on praxis. Okay? Meaning, they argued that it was important not just to theorize, but to do the political and epistemic work of delinking, disentangling, disengaging from Eurocentrism. So the key idea here is that, for our purposes, is that disciplinarity for them, the creation of disciplines, the categorization of ideas into different disciplines, was an was an important part of modernity. Okay? It was an important feature of modernization, but there's a dark side to it. It was also a tool of epistemic suppression and epistemicide, so that if you weren't recognized, for example, according to Western institutions, to be a scientist, then your voice was not taken seriously. Okay? Your voice was silenced. And this epistemic suppression was intertwined with the subjugation of people. So the question for us to think about today is whether transdisciplinarity, okay, can be a decolonial approach to climate education. And some of the arguments that make the possible answer yes is that transdisciplinarity challenges disciplinal hegemonies. It challenges the idea, for example, that the hard scientists are the most important field, and then the social sciences are beneath that, and the arts are way down below, and somebody who doesn't identify with any discipline at all cannot be a knowledge producer. It recognizes all participants as potential experts, or accepts that no one is the sole expert. So it creates a more democratizing way of understanding issues and creating knowledge and talking about solutions. Now, there are reasons to challenge this idea because there are still the questions surrounding power. Who leads? Who has the power to frame questions? And most importantly, for whom is the knowledge generated? When we create knowledge, who actually benefits from this? And I'll turn over now to my colleague Alice to say more about this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rawi. I think that was a really great introduction, and also something so different from what I'm going to speak about. So just to note that I come from a mainstream climate research background, and I don't work with concepts much of decoloniality, decolonization, coloniality. But I have been increasingly adopting a skeptical perspective on mainstream knowledge making and the knowledge making within the institutions that I sit. And first to say, I'm really excited to hear from all of you a little bit later, but hopefully some of my reflections on some of the practices that I've been involved in can also spark some thinking for the discussion in a moment. So I'd like to start off by saying that I think that transdisciplinarity can be an attempt to undo or unlearn some of the aspects of the colonial legacy by placing emphasis on pluralism and on bottom-up methodologies that really center the voices of historically marginalized people. But as Dr. Rawi has pointed out, if it's not organized in a way that doesn't pay close attention to power and to discrimination and oppression, it often does perpetuate these dynamics. So I was involved recently in a piece of work where we used a fairly simple framework for thinking through some of the dimensions of power in our transdisciplinary work. And so we tried to consider the sources of power and the way that power was wielded in transdisciplinary projects. And actually we drew on work by Fritz and Binder, who themselves drew on different theories related to power. So once again, my focus is on transdisciplinarity. I don't theorize around power. But we were all early career researchers who had been principal investigators on a project called Leading Integrated Research for Agenda 2030 in Africa, so focused on cities and all involved in transdisciplinary work. And at the end, we got together as a group of PIs from different African countries to reflect on how power dynamics had manifested in and influenced our work. And so I worked in South Africa, had a colleague working in Ghana and a colleague working in Kenya and Uganda. And so we considered instrumental, structural, and discursive sources of power and how these influenced participation in the transdisciplinary work that we had organized and had implemented. So if we think about it in terms of the questions that we were asking questions such as who decides who participated in the work that we did, who set the agenda and the rules for the process, in what ways do the structural conditions or did the structural conditions influence participation and also the agenda, and then how did the norms that existed in the space or that we brought with us influence who participates and how the agenda was set. And so using this fairly simple framework, we discovered some major blind spots in our work, particularly around the design of the learning processes. And we are talking today about education and learning. And these learning processes, what we discovered in some instances, really privileged particular groups of people, even though they were designed as transdisciplinary projects. So firstly, in terms of the framing, there was a theme that was set up, obviously, by the funders initially. And as researchers and people who come from a particular knowledge context, we also had our own agendas. And this is something that's really tricky to figure out, how we become truly responsive in a knowledge economy or a knowledge space that is essentially governed by actually very few, very powerful groups of people. And this is where the idea of coloniality comes in. But reflexivity was really critical to surface personal ideas and agendas when we reflected on this work. Second, in terms of the methods, and I hope we can discuss methods in a bit more detail today, some of the early career researchers were much more sensitive to appropriate methods in the context in which they were working, and not introducing methods that weren't culturally appropriate or suitable for people who weren't used to engaging in those ways. So, for example, very structured workshops that are focused on a European sort of way of learning, but also questionnaires, pieces of paper, that really set up a dynamic in terms of how you speak to people in different contexts. And then lastly, how knowledge is produced and shared. So we can work towards learning processes that do value plural ways of knowing and that do center voices of people who've been historically marginalized. But if we need to keep on bringing this back to the academy at some point and consolidate in academic outputs, there will always be an oppression of sorts. And this is something that, again, I'd really like to discuss in more detail today. So the form of transdisciplinarity that I have been exposed to is imagined in the academy. And I would love to hear from others who have different ideas around transdisciplinarity. But I think as those in the academy, we really need to reorientate and break and be truly transgressive to decolonize. And maybe as a last point, something that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently is this idea of fluidity. And so the word trans and the ethic of transdisciplinarity is aligned with fluidity, but that's not actually being met in many instances. So as the panelist before me mentioned, much more plural and fluid ways of knowing and being, or different ways of knowing and being existed, which were raised during colonial Enlightenment thinking, which is the root of what all of us are exposed to today. So I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion. Hopefully, as I said, I can bring some of these transdisciplinary experiences into the discussion. But I think, yeah, as a final point, I think it's really critical to identify and engage with dimensions or sources of power and privilege throughout the transdisciplinary process. And we can't manage power away. It exists, it's always there, but we can recognize and work with power, especially those which are rooted in colonization, which pervade pretty much everything that we do. So thank you very much. I think that's it from me for now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rowie and Alice. That was a very brief, but also I think a very succinct way to encapsulate, the themes that we're working on in today's session on transdisciplinarity and colonialism. We've received a few private messages containing some questions, but before we dive into those questions, I'd also like to extend the invitation to the rest of our audience to please type in any questions or comments you have in the chat. We will definitely address these later on, but if you're more comfortable, please feel free to drop us a private message and we can include those in the questions. Also, please rename yourselves according to the instructions by our tech team in the chat. So whether you identify as a member of the academe, government, civil society, or private sector. All right. So with that bit of admin and housekeeping done, I am happy to get into our first question. Okay. So I guess this is in response as well to both of your talks earlier about the concept of disciplinarity and its historical roots. And this person asks if disciplinarity can be thought of as a form of exclusion and hierarchy. Does transdisciplinarity adequately push back against this disciplinal division, and especially in practice? Maybe we can hear first from Dr. Rowie.
Um, th- that's a great question, and I think it's the question that part of the question that we're exploring today. As I think Alice has said, there are many attempts to be transdisciplinal, which still end up reinforcing some of the previous power hierarchies. Um, and perhaps this goes much deeper than just trying to be inclusive, right? Maybe it has something to do with the processes that we use, the structure that we use, and maybe just the social norms that we're accustomed to. I mean, I was introduced, for example, as Doctor blah 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 from blah 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 university. Immediately, that already reinforces certain hierarchies. The format that we're using today, which begins with with so-called expert panelists, again, right, reinforces all of these hierarchies. I suppose the one more optimistic and hopeful approach is to just accept that we'll never be perfect at it, but to just keep trying and to constantly reflect on what the practices are that reinforce these hierarchies and create exclusionary and dominating relationships, and then try to self correct as we keep moving forward.
Yeah, so very much like an iterative process of improving how we see and how we relate to each other.
Yeah.
Alice, would you like to add anything?
Thanks. Yeah, I really like that you reflected on that point, because actually when I was invited to be a part of this panel, I was thinking I'd here with somebody who's a associate professor and has a doctorate, and feeling very nervous about being part of this discussion. But there again, in my mind and everything that I do in terms of how we think about disciplinary knowledge and what it means in terms of what we can offer. And I think as you've already mentioned, transdisciplinarity, or as you've alluded to, I think it is like any other tool, and I use that word very loosely, in that the process and the outcomes are really defined by the values and the beliefs of the people who are working with it. And there are lots of different ideas and different ways that transdisciplinarity has been worked with and implemented. And there are a couple of different principles that cut across these different ways of working. So it should be context driven. It should be emphasizing pluralism and diversity and co-production of knowledge. But these principles are often given varying emphases depending on the inclination of the people who is working with this idea of transdisciplinarity. And actually, a lot of people just see transdisciplinarity as a blending of different types of knowledge, including academic knowledge and non-academic knowledge. And so I think that if we want to be decolonial in our approach or anti-colonial in our approach with transdisciplinarity, this idea of transgression is really important, or this principle of transgression is really important, which is written about a lot in the transdisciplinary literature. And what do we mean when we talk about transgression? We're talking about something that really questions and criticizes, takes a critical perspective on everything that we know. And it can be very challenging, but it can lead to transformations in terms of how we understand and act, particularly in the knowledge space. So I think that's a great question to kick things off with. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks, Alice, and thanks, Rowie. It's great that Rowie spoke of processes and cultural norms, and Alice, you spoke about what we can offer depending on where we are situated and from what sector we're working in. And I like how you also made that bit of wordplay with how do we transgress and go beyond, how we traditionally think of transdisciplinarity. So this next question actually is very much related to what you shared earlier. And they ask, while we have the word anti-racist in our lexicon, is there a quote unquote anti-colonial way to approach research more broadly beyond participation. And I think this the person asking this is also going back to Alice, what you mentioned about how we try to challenge the structure of our projects to go beyond simple participation.
Yeah, again, a great question. I'm sure that that Rawi has a lot more to say on this, but I think that, and again, yeah, so something that Ted mentioned in the very beginning, that this idea of knowledge and knowledge making being very political. So recognizing all the time that how we understand knowledge and how we produce knowledge and how we work with knowledge, all of that is extremely political. And critically engaging with power and privilege and discrimination, which are deeply, deeply rooted in historical or colonial contexts and practices. And also understanding that colonialism and colonial thinking pervades absolutely everything that we do. And that undoing that it requires this constant reflection and reflexivity. And it's not just about, we keep on saying this, it's not just about being inclusive and about integrating different ways of knowing. It's about challenging what constitutes knowledge, and who defines knowledge and who defines people as knowledgeable. And ultimately really decentering Western or Eurocentric ways of knowing. Yeah, I think Rawi probably has a lot more to add.
So there's an excellent book that was written quite some time ago now by Linda Tuhiwai Smith, entitled Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous Peoples. She was writing for the social sciences. She was writing about qualitative methods, but it's a really good place to start for people who are interested in exploring more anti-colonial methodologies. And she draws from her experience as a Maori woman who has worked a lot with Maori communities, and she develops certain ideas around how to make academic research more decolonial from the very moment that you begin thinking about your question and designing your work. So that's a good place to start. Since then, a lot has been written about decolonial methodologies and other disciplines as well, but this is probably one of the most important seminal works.
Thank you, Rowie and Alice. There's a lot of rich concepts here that we're sharing that I hope we can discuss later on. Perhaps in the breakout sessions, these might come up organically from the participants. And thank you for sharing the link in the chat. So for those members of our audience who are interested in learning more and reading more about this resource, you can check out the message in the chat box. So just going back on what we've mentioned on challenging what constitutes knowledge and how we decenter knowledge from Western models. Our next question is from our colleague Dr. Vandana Singh. Okay, and she asks, what do you think about the positionality of science, especially climate science, in the context of transdisciplinarity and coloniality? So lots to unpack here. I mean, anyone feel free to start the conversation.
Alice, would
maybe
you go first?
Yeah, I was going to say maybe I can kick off coming from a sort of mainstream climate research context. And this is something that I grapple with a lot. And actually over the last couple of weeks, thinking about, whether there's a need to down tools within my current practice and move to somewhere else completely, thinking about how things work. But I don't think that, I think that there's a need to be a little bit more careful and also to think about how different ways of understanding and knowing can come together. I think that climate science, and already there have been some events as part of this working group that have been organized that looks at colonialism and climate science in particular, and the kind of the violence of modeling in terms of ignoring other ways of knowing the climate and the weather, have perpetuated us. They're everywhere in the world. It's how people understand modern climate research and climate science. But I think that there is value in terms of scientific processes that help us to understand the climate historically and in the future. but it's it's this single way of thinking about the world and the single way of understanding the climate that is extremely oppressive and violent, I think. And so I think if we can bring our scientific understandings of climate together with other ways of knowing the climate and thinking about the climate and weather, I think that there's huge potential for trying to get out of this destructive place where we find ourselves at the moment. Yeah, I think we need a very big paradigm shift in terms of how we understand climate and weather, and how we think about navigating this problem, which is much more based on a relational way of understanding the world and understanding people. So I hope I haven't offended any of my climate science colleagues, but that's my initial input, and I hand over to Rowena.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. My own view is that the issue is not science, the issue is power, right? The issue is domination. And the history of science, like all disciplines, have had stories of domination and power within it. But that's not unique at all to science, right? I've just been in the archives looking at anthropology, for example. So I anecdotally, and I've done some work in climate education. I think today there is still, from the climate education perspective, a very STEM centric way of approaching climate education, which I think is important. But even just for pure pragmatic and practical purposes, I think we all intuitively know that climate education and the urgency of the issues surrounding the climate crisis cannot be solved by science alone. It also requires political education. It also requires civic education. It also requires ecological education and arts education. Really, a different way of thinking. And so, rather than get into a discussion of which discipline is more important, I think just purely from a pragmatic perspective, we can all agree that we need all hands on deck. And I think that that alone will be enough to make us more open to one another and to be more willing to listen to one another.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very beautiful way to wrap up your answer, Rowie. And something that both of you said triggered a memory from a few years ago. I attended a talk about the history of climate science and noticed that the slides were mostly made up of white men and only one woman, Eunice Foote. Okay. And it made me reflect on what type of knowledge my ancestors must have been producing, but which even up to today, around 200 years later, is still not considered as valid in many circles. So just branching off from that, and perhaps we have time for one more question. This question reads, climate science and education is under attack in some parts of the world, but climate impacts affect us unequally. So I suppose, looking at the patterns of, where the former colonies are, where the former empires are, do attacks on science today constitute a more complex form of colonial attack? So quite a big question to unpack. But maybe before we invite you to answer, I see that Doc Kendra has her hand raised.
Oh, hello. Thank you for recognizing you. This is for a different question. So I don't know if you want to go ahead and answer that one first.
Um, uh, Quite simply, I'll just say yes. It's there. I mean, it's very complicated. I mean, we're talking about disinformation. We're talking about political interests that are intertwined with a lot of this disinformation. But we're also talking about histories of exclusion that people have felt, and some of this climate denial and science denial stemming from histories of exclusion. And so, yes, in the sense that not in the sense that we'll just point a finger at everyone and say, oh, you're being colonial, you're being colonial, but yes, in the sense that I think that coloniality is a very helpful analytical tool coupled with other analytical tools, right, to understand how power dynamics and power disparities play and continue to play into some of the challenges that we're facing in terms of addressing the climate emergency.
I think that was very eloquent. I'm happy to leave it there. Thank you.
Would you like to add anything, Alice?
No, I was going to say I think that was great. I think, as Rawi said, it's a very, very, very entangled and complex question, but I think she's made some really critical points that I'm happy to. Yeah, I completely support. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you. I thank you for making that a succinct answer. So perhaps now we can have Doc Kendra's question to round out the panel discussion.
Thank you. I was trying to type my question or my thoughts, but it's such a rich discussion that it might be easier to just try and articulate. So Dr. Rowe mentioned that part of the colonial legacy is that those who do not identify with a particular discipline are in a sense disempowered. Right? They're not, they find themselves being displaced from that hierarchy. But very recently, someone shared with me a journal article on the undisciplinary journey of early career researchers. And it wasn't a new article, but it's the first time I've heard of the term undisciplinary. And it was used to refer to this experience of ECRs who start out with an interdisciplinary background early rather than rooting themselves firmly in a disciplinary niche and then branching out from there. And I think it made the point that it's still a very uncomfortable space, but the article was trying, I think, to push this forward as an alternate pathway and describe this undisciplinary journey very much in the same way, with the same words that I would hear transdisciplinary to be described. That it's problem-based, collaborative, a focus on partnerships with iteration, reflexivity. And so I wonder if in these recent years, have you sensed that there is this growing movement within the academe to try and question these hierarchies? And so these terms like undisciplinary or transdisciplinary are maybe a genuine response, or how do we make sure that they can be a genuine response to that and not still sort of be hindered by any vestige of these hierarchies?
I'm happy to go first, and Rai can maybe come in afterwards. And it's interesting because I was talking to a colleague recently about our experiences of first year or sort of undergraduate students who seem to have a different take on learning and on disciplines, or on looking across different disciplines. And I know also within the university that I'm from, there's this move to, again, try and think about learning that is very much focused on problems and draws on the ideas and ways of thinking from lots of different disciplines. But again, we mentioned earlier this idea of power, and I wonder how ideas around power and privilege and oppression are brought into these discussions, because it goes beyond drawing on different ideas and on even, beyond pluralism. It really is questioning or interrogating and thinking about what knowledge is and how knowledge is used. So I think that there's a movement towards this way of thinking about things, and transdisciplinarity is one way of doing this, but it's also just tapping into something else that has existed for a long time but has not been allowed to feature as prominently. But I still think there's a lot of work to be done, and I think it's really, really hard. It also depends on who you're speaking to and whether they are looking at complex problems, or there's still a lot of structures and norms that perpetuate privilege and discrimination across the universities. But there is a trend. I'm seeing a general trend. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is not just for anti-colonial reasons, but also for other reasons. There is a greater openness to interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work. There's an irony in the question, right? That we're talking about decoloniality, but we're still trying to ask for the permission of the university to allow us to do transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary work. And again, that goes back to the power. But I don't think that the call is that everybody needs to become an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary researcher, right? I think the call is that wherever it is that we are, as researchers and knowledge producers, and by knowledge producers, I'm referring to people aren't who don't self-identify as researchers, but people who work in government and civil society. I think it's really a call to be willing to collaborate, to listen, to be and institutionally for institutions to create those spaces of synergy, and to enable things like this to happen rather than disable it, right? Make it easy for us to work with one another rather than creating the obstacles that hinder those initiatives.
Yeah. This has been such a rich conversation, and I see that we also have another question in the chat from our participant, Joel Duque. Um, if it's all right with Alice and Rowie, perhaps we can send his question to you via email, and then we can also share your responses to those who are registered for this webinar. So, Sir Joel, I hope that you don't mind. It's 4:45 right now, unfortunately we've reached the end of the panel discussion or the time allotted for the panel discussion, but we will be sure to provide you with the response of our panelists. Right. But again, really, thank you very much, Rowie and Alice. This has been such a rich conversation, and 30 minutes for this has really not been enough because there's really so many things to untangle, and I think that for a lot of our participants, these needed to percolate a bit more for everyone. So at this moment, again, thank you very much to Rowie and Alice. At this point, we will now be moving on to our next part of the program, which are the breakout sessions. Okay. So according to our tech team, there will be 8 breakout sessions to accommodate everyone who is in the call right now. Okay. Each breakout room will have around 5 participants. Okay. And for the next 30 minutes, participants will be given the opportunity to dissect the links between colonialism and transdisciplinarity. Okay, so taking inputs not just from what we've heard from the panelists today, but also from your own experiences and your own reflections. Each room will have facilitators who will be guiding the discussion, and we will all make use of a platform known as Mirrorboard, the link of which will also be shared in the chat shortly by our tech team. If in case any of you may have left the Zoom space during the call or get disconnected, you may re-enter and one of our technical team will redirect you to your respective group. So may I ask the tech team? Oh, there we go. So thank you very much. Our tech team has just shared the Miro board link in the chat. The breakout rooms will be good for 30 minutes. Okay. And again, as a reminder for our audience on Facebook Live, unfortunately, the breakout rooms themselves will not be part of the live stream. However, please feel free to sit back and perhaps uh, consider these questions, which we will also be answering in our respective breakout sessions. We'll see you in 30 minutes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Finally, we're able to record that. Thanks. And then I'm also reading another one because I know you're not able to read. You're also talking about the paying attention to human experiences, perhaps stronger thrush in qualitative research. Oh, okay. Ethnography to be able to study more I'll say the lived experiences, humanities research to paint a clear picture of humans being affected by climate change. So what I hear you say about maybe we should consider the approaches, the research approaches that will be helpful, that will really help us to dig deeper into the lived experiences, to be able to capture the realities on the ground, so we can be able to integrate them or use them to develop tailored solutions. Thanks for those reflections.
So thanks for sharing those initial reflections from your group. I'd like to welcome everyone back to the main room here on Zoom, and I hope that everyone had a fruitful session with their respective breakout rooms. I see from the mirror board that everyone was really able to have a very nice and filled table from their respective breakout rooms. So I'd like to open now for for a sharing. We have 8 groups here. I'm not sure if we'll be able to accommodate everyone, but if anyone would like to raise their hand and perhaps share some of the reflections or the results of the discussion from their respective breakout rooms, we'd love to hear from you. So if you'd like to speak, feel free to raise your hand. I know that earlier your facilitators might have already asked some of you to assign someone to serve as the person to share their insights in the plenary. So please just feel free to raise your hand or unmute. Okay. Yes, perhaps we can start with JK Asturias.
Hi, hello. I'm JK from the Philippines, from Group 1, Breakout Group 1. And I'm just going to give a very quick summary, working through each question. So thank you to my colleagues for all of the great inputs, no? In terms of perceiving the links and the colonialism, in our group, we brought up of course, the domination of the Western worldview in research. In terms of practice, language is also a main barrier. As many of you may not know, actually, the Philippines in particular has more than 100+ different languages. And a lot of these are misaligned and misinterpreted. Okay, sorry, one moment. Let me just open my camera. Okay, hello. Hi, everyone. Okay, I'll be as quick as possible. So, and on my end, I had shared my experiences with working with international organizations. Where does the money, where we're having a lot of money coming from the West, and those espouse particular methodologies or particular approaches, which of course gain primacy in the discussion rather than championing localized or regionalized approaches, which in many cases, or in some cases, turns out do not always work in our localized context, right? As for imagining what an anti-colonial transdisciplinary approach would be, we thought about it in terms of the research, maybe looking at an approach that includes local participation, such as participatory research, workshops, with as many sectors as possible. And I think my takeaway from this, and our group's takeaway from this, is in my mind at least, what if the answer to the question, in my opinion, to what is anti-colonial transdisciplinary approach, in my mind, it's like, okay, what is more anti-colonial than championing and giving a voice to those who are oppressed, right? And through our specific, because our background, the background of the group is more on research and community engagement and project management. We do a lot of these workshops with on the ground local governments and the communities themselves. So through asking these provocative questions, we're able to elicit these robust responses that through traditional modes of knowledge acquisition, or through the typical methodologies you wouldn't typically get. And finally, for the last one, 5 insights, principles, or guidelines. I'll just mention them very quickly. Participatory action research, that's one. It should be geared, number 2, research as empowerment. Third, right of nature, social and ecological. Fourth, intergenerational knowledge systems. And fifth, solidarity both from community and regional organizations. So that's it for me. This is Group 1. Thank you.
Thank you, JK, and thank you, Group 1. It's very nice that you covered a lot of ground in your discussion, and although there is the recognition that we have to be contextual and mindful of our local histories and local context, it's nice that your group also mentions some international concepts such as right of nature. Learning from taking from best practices elsewhere. Okay. Yes, Doc Kendra?
Yes, so I'm from Breakout Room 8, and we weren't able to assign someone to share, so I will just share some of my notes as the facilitator. We didn't quite get through all the questions, but I think some key things to share. Like the first group, we also have this experience of the content of our education being more Western in terms of the background. PJ, for example, coming more from philosophy, and myself from STEM. And we have this common experience of needing to be deliberate if we wanted to hear other voices. We needed to seek them out. So in a sense, there's this chicken and egg problem, that if you want to reform curriculum, then where do we start? And has to start with the teachers maybe being deliberate about seeking out these other voices to decolonialize the curriculum. The other thing that came out from our discussions is about stories. Victor had mentioned that he had, I think, joined some of the our webinars on climate stories in the past. And at least from his experience, there's not enough diversity or representation of those who need to be at the table when we're talking about climate policies and climate programs. And so in a sense, the stories that are being shared are not the stories of the people who need to be represented. And so those communities don't see themselves as part of the discourse. And Vandana had raised the point that perhaps stories are a double-edged sword, and maybe they can be used as a tool, as a gateway to counter transdisciplinary and power dynamics if we start with precisely inviting, or not inviting, that sounds like such a term where I'm asking you to come to me, but us going out and seeking out the stories, the lived experience of those who should have been at the table. And PJ also shared that in her experience with youth groups in a community she's working with, they use stories in social media as a gateway to talking about the science. So they're able to talk about issues in ways that are familiar to them and to their people, but also in a way that reaches into that sustainability space. And unfortunately, that's where the time ended for us.
Thanks, Doc Kendra. Well, I guess, talking up until the time runs out is a good measure of how engrossed we can become in our conversations. I like how your group also pointed out to, the chicken and egg situation. Where exactly do we start? How can we design enabling structures so we can, start that positive feedback loop? And it's also great that you guys touch on stories and whose stories are being told, because that gets into, whose epistemologies are considered as valid. Okay. And I think that bridges us very well into the sharing of group three, maybe. Okay. Because so for transparency, I was one of the facilitators for group three. Maybe we can have someone from group three to share very quickly about what we did.
Okay, hello. This is Jenny. Good afternoon, everyone. I think my other group mate don't have an audio. I start my video. Okay. Hello. Okay. Hi. Okay. Let me see. For the first question, yung what are the I cannot see it. Please. What might be an anti-colonial transdisciplinary approach look like? Rowena, technical difficulty. Okay. On the first question, how do we perceive things? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
How
Yeah.
how to perceive the links between our current frameworks and colonialism. So it's a good insight that my colleague, teammate, emphasized that our legal system is still a mix of foreign laws from our from the Spanish and from the American. And being a colony, it's also still we can still observe that our mindset is on the extractive institution which we inherited from our colonial masters. So andun pa rin tayo and we haven't get out of that mindset yet totally. So when it comes to the anti-colonial transdisciplinary approach, it's almost the same from our from groups 1 and 2. That needs to be inclusive. We need to include traditional and ecological knowledge or the traditional knowledge that we have. And we also discuss about the science-based policies. And we have a very good discussion about this because there's a question of what is a science-based policies. And if you can look at our education system, mostly this is because of it was brought by our by our it's there's a hint of colonialism when it comes to our education, and it's important now that we inject or revive our traditional knowledge. We also put here that yes, we need to be inclusive and strengthen the implementation of legal pluralism. So we need to have a legal basis in everything that we do. We need to involve the indigenous law because sometimes it's not applicable to all. Like Daniel mentioned about the BARMs, and they have a different set of tradition or culture that we need to consider when it comes to these laws. And that also informs the strengthening the customary and indigenous governance of the system rather than imposing like a single solution for everything. Now, what are the 5 insights or the principles that we want to implement? Again, the word of inclusive here, we want it to make it simple. So there's a participation of everyone from top down or from all level of the society. So it needs to be applicable to our current situation. So it needs to be adjusted. The LGU collaboration and also mention the participation of those that are really affected or who's experiencing the current challenges. And here we also emphasize the importance of documentation and data gathering. So we mentioned earlier one of the anti-colonial disciplinary approach is uh, to revive the traditional knowledge. We want to have it documented so it can be passed down to generation. And we need to have a good data or information gathering so we can use it if we need to adjust some policy or to prioritize some research. And lastly, my my teammate, by the way, is a lawyer, so it's very important to have we have a discussion to have some legal basis, because if we don't have that, if we are really relying to goodwill or the voluntarism, medyo 50-50 when it comes to our for the enforcement or um the success of this project, so or any program. So the legal basis will be very important. Thank you. That's for group 3.
Thank you, Jenny. And just echoing client's message in the chat box. Thank you for taking one for the team. No, so thank you very much. Let's move on now to maybe someone from Group 4 who would like to share.
Okay, I was the designated report because I had the least connection problem. That was how it wound up.
Oh.
Just I guess certainly colonialism has affected the disciplines, especially in meteorology, hydrology. The example was given of the Dutch and water management, and so on. And meteorology itself has been very much driven by empire and so on. There's actually quite a literature on that. Actually, that was in the education working group webinar series. But a lot of these things are not going to change easily, and a lot of the disciplines are essentially reinforced through different mechanisms like research funding and assessment processes. We're not going to change that overnight, obviously, so we have to somehow recognize that. In terms of and being anti-colonial, I think it seems that disciplines themselves are, in some sense, constructs, right? They can change over time. It's Kuhn talked about and so on. So if transdisciplinary, and I think Alice referred to this, perhaps I've forgotten actually, but that if it's just a merger of different disciplines to create a new discipline, that's just another form of disciplinarity, and it can be exclusive. So it's the fluidity that somehow is important, the lack of definition, and I think some of the earlier comments here pointed to that. If you try to pin things down too much, you actually defeat the purpose. So allowing this openness, allowing a fluidity is really crucial. But of course, that's well, and language is a key part of that. So there was some comments a little bit about language and how terminology can have different meanings in different communities, and rather than trying to resolve that with a grand unified definition of a term like risk or uncertainty, we just have to recognize that it has different meanings in different communities. I think so opening up the discussion by using terms that have these different meanings across communities is a very good way to do it. Actually, Vandana in her book talked about some examples of that as well. And also, I guess the final thing is really to insist on the link between theory and practice, especially when the practice is not some really big practice like high level, hydropower for a whole country or something, but really at the local scale. And then you privilege local knowledge almost by you move the grounds of the, if you think of a military analogy, you want to be fighting from uphill, not downhill, and you can change the terms of reference of the discussions by situating things at a very local scale where the disciplinary practices tend to fail, and then you have an opportunity to try to open up the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ted, and thanks, Group 4. I like how you guys really dug into reinforcing mechanisms. You know, it's like moving a giant elephant, and the change can sometimes be frustratingly gradual. So I also like how you mentioned allowing that fluidity and finding the balance, you know. So with that, we have maybe time for one more group to share. So would anyone from maybe groups 5, 6, 7, or 8 like to volunteer? Okay, so we have Lillian, one of our facilitators. Yes, Lillian?
Okay, thank you. I'll just quick an overview of group reflections, and which ideally, of course, reflects or echoes the earlier speaker. So thank you very much. We're seeing commonly continue or the themes of, our continuation of colonialism that shapes the knowledge production, validation, and how it's applied. So we're seeing our formal education systems that continue to prioritize Western scientific methods of, and that actually have continually undermine the indigenous and local knowledge systems that are regarded as unscientific. And in this case, we fail to integrate the knowledge of the people that are entrusted with this, stewardship, management of resources at the local level, that we expect them to actually contribute to the solutions. And as we put focus more into policy-driven solutions that really do not reflect the realities on the ground. So we also see that the education system continually perpetuates this, trend whereby the university place priorities in certain areas of STEM, regarding some areas like sciences, seeing as more valued than others. In this case, also restricting students who are forced to conform rather than suggest contribute to solutions production. And also you find that this kind of approach really influences other stakeholders, like the parents also are now forced to see that particular fields are more important, and they end up dictating to what their students, their children should be doing. And at the end of the day, we end up to produce graduates that are not fit or end up working in fields that are not passionate about. So ending up having, these disconnected solutions to the society. Also, the media plays a very important role in this, whereby we continually see the Western ideas such as journalistic values and publication, biases in this particular landscape. In regards to anti-colonial approach, a reflection sees that instead of treating the Western scientific frameworks as the default, then why not look into approach where places priority on indigenous, local experiential knowledge at the core of research and decision making? And of course, mirroring this, considering other approaches such as liberal arts that will have, provides that opportunity to be able to explore interdisciplinary and nature of issues. Although we need to do this with intentionality in connecting with key communities, as well as, which can be able to improve on it. And just on the principles, we see that if we can be able to uphold the human dignity as a basic principles in our discussions in different forums, so that we might have disagreements in the climate goals, but the need to protect, if we see the impact on the population, the most vulnerable populations, for example, if we put that in the forefront, then we probably be able to generate solutions that are more sensitive, that are more, will be able to address the solutions that we are looking for. And of course, the need to actually be able to be transgressive or challenge and restructure the climate policy, for example, the funding, whereby we have the resources and the donors, the governments and all that, community-driven education efforts that are, the funds and all that being driven to grassroots and community-led climate education efforts instead. The need also to break the institutional barriers and encourage the cross-movement, solidarity, whereby we bring different actors, the civil society, the human rights activists, and the researchers, and all to come together to be able to, so we can be able to, to work together to generate solutions to the issues that face the globe. And importantly, I think it ties into what you're already talking about, paying attention to human experiences and perhaps considering our research approaches, the methodology. Can we have more robust research methods, the qualitative, that we are able to dig into, get the lived realities of the most vulnerable or the populations to contribute to solutions. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Lillian. Buzzer beater because it's exactly 5:45 now. It's exactly 45 minutes past the hour. I like how one of your principles is really embracing a rights-based approach, finding points of commonality and what unites us, especially in the face of climate impacts. So thank you very much to everyone, even if your group wasn't able to share during this session. We really appreciate all of the work, and that's visible in the Miro board, as we can see. So now that we move on to the next part of the program, I'd like to present these certificates of appreciation. Firstly, to our first speaker, Dr. Rowena Azada-Palacios, for sharing her time and insights with the My Climate Risk community in today's event titled Transdisciplinarity and Colonialism in Climate Education on the 12th of March, 2025. And we would also like to present the same certificate to our second speaker, Ms. Alice McClure, for sharing her time and insights with us. And these certificates are signed by myself as the focal point of the Ateneo de Manila University Regional Hub, by Dr. Vandana Singh, the lead of the MCR Education Working Group, and by Dr. Christopher Jack, the focal point of the MCR University of Cape Town Hub. Thank you very much to Alice, to Rowie. I'm sure that all of our participants will really come away from this session with a lot of rich insights. And while this has been a truly remarkable and fruitful session, I'd like to invite a colleague from a new group within the MCR community to deliver a succinct synthesis of today's event. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Vincent Lam, the lead of the MCR Philosophy Working Group. Dr. Lam, welcome to the event.
Yes, thank you very much, Danielle. And first of all, I'd like to thank everyone being here and for this very rich discussions. Was really very, very rich and interesting for me participating to this event. I don't have the ambition to make a synthesis of all what has been said. It would be too rich in a sense. Just to highlight first from the discussions, I've heard the importance of taking into account the particular specific experiences and practices. I think this is something which is extremely relevant. So this focus on the praxis in a certain sense, Rowie also mentioned, and this notion of fluidity mentioned by Alice. This question of not to break a little bit these disciplinary boundaries. And finally, I'll also like to highlight something which came up at several times in the discussions. The very political nature of the kind of reflections we're having, and I think this is something which needs to be acknowledged, and I think this is something very important when discussing questions related to power. This is something which is deeply and fundamentally political. So now, if I may, I'd like to share my screen. I have a few slides.
So we are currently seeing the Miro board, and there we go. Yeah, now we see the slides.
Sorry. Yeah, so you can see now. So as I said, I don't have the ambition to make really a synthesis of all the rich discussions that took place here. Rather, I'll just make a few comments about kind of philosophy of science perspective on some of the topics which have been or discussed today. But first, I just wanted to make a few comments about a new working group. So the philosophy working group within My Climate Risk. So it has been recently formed, so it's really starting in a sense, and the aim is to explore and develop fruitful interactions between climate science and in particular in the context of my climate risk perspective and philosophy of science in particular. We're currently a diverse, heterogeneous group, which is again something very rich. And a challenge or a fruitful challenge we have currently facing is trying to define and develop a common language between different disciplines, people from different background, and so on. And this is something which is extremely rich in many ways. We had a starting event, a workshop, My Climate Risk Meets Philosophy of Science, last October at the University of Bern, with a number of scientists coming from different regions of the world and different backgrounds. So we had the chance that these people were coming in Europe. So we took this chance for inviting them in Bern for this workshop, and that's a little bit the launching event for this philosophy working group. And we're currently having a reading group. We had so far 2 online meetings in last December and February, and there is a forthcoming one. So you're welcome to join. And of course, we have now these connections because there are a very interesting connection with the kind of interests topics that are discussed within the education working group, and it's really a pleasure to be here today. Now, just quickly a few thoughts again from a very humble philosophy of science perspective, in a sense, about some of the topics that have been discussed. I think there is an acknowledgement in philosophy of science, typically. That's where I'm coming from, about the limitations of this kind of siloed disciplinary approach to the global environmental challenges. This is something which is, I think, widely acknowledged. And transdisciplinarity itself is a subject of study in philosophy of science. There is a scholarship in philosophy of science and of course in other disciplines about what transdisciplinarity is in the first place. But also what is interesting is that philosophy of science recently is becoming an actor in a certain sense of transdisciplinarity itself. And this is a kind of interesting development in the sense that philosophy of science is expected to help to analyze, for instance, or navigate different epistemologies, ontologies, and values, as we can see from this quote here in a recent philosophy of science paper about transdisciplinarity. And in philosophy of science, there is an ongoing tradition about reflecting about the value-laden, so-called value-laden dimensions of science and knowledge production, which can be here of some interest, where a number of criteria typically have been identified. We talked about them, which in the discussions about transparency, representativeness in a certain sense, diversity, transdisciplinarity, of course, critical reflexivity, and many others. Now, these kind of transdisciplinary reflections face a number of challenges. For instance, there are a number of levels, dimensions, scales that need to be taken into account at the level of the individual scientists. There is a number of questions, but also at the level of the scientific institutions themselves, as we've seen in the discussions. Now, there is also the question we're talking about climate change, but of course, climate change is part of a larger, multidimensional story of global social environmental disruptions. What sometimes is labeled Anthropocene. There's now discussions about this label, but the idea is that this is part of a larger story that needs a multidimensional story that need to be taken into account. And there are, of course, different scales, as we've discussed, the local, regional, and global scales that need to be taken into account. And of course, all these reflections are not articulated in a historical or social political vacuum. They are typical. This is typically not the case, and hence, as has been highlighted, there is clearly an urgent need to critically reflect on and seriously address these various dimensions of the power structures and dynamics at these various scales, typically as I've just mentioned. And this is the topic of today. In this context, I think there is an extreme relevance of the kind of decolonial perspectives and work and scholarship in general, but for philosophy of science in particular in the context of I've just mentioned, in order to acknowledge these different power dynamics that cannot be we cannot get rid of them, as Rowie mentioned, but they need somehow to be managed, and this is an ongoing, never-ending process in a certain sense. And just a last word about possible ways forwards. The idea being to develop and cultivate some kind of justice sensibilities in a certain sense. I also here mention epistemic integrity. There's would be discussions to be had about this notion of epistemic integrity, but I think in the context of attacks on science, this has been also mentioned. This is something which also need to be taken into account. So these kind of two aspects, this justice sensibilities on the one hand, and also these dimensions related to epistemic integrity of science and knowledge production more generally. And that's all for me. Thank you very much. And again, I'm very happy to, very glad and grateful for these discussions I had today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lam, and we're certainly excited to see the Philosophy Working Group grow. And now to deliver the closing remarks, I would like to call on our dear colleague, Dr. Vandana Singh, who is joining us all the way from Massachusetts. She is the lead of the MCR Education Working Group and one of our organizing partners. Dr. Singh, the floor is yours.
Greetings, everyone. Well, what a wonderful session we had. I think it's going to be a great, exercise later on when we get together to look at the Miro board in more detail. So it is my pleasure to acknowledge and to thank from my heart our speakers, Rowie and Alice, for so generously sharing their knowledge and insights. And also to Vincent for his enlightening summary and making the connection to the philosophy of science. And to all three of you for also helping with the planning and facilitation. And let me also, with the greatest pleasure, thank Daniel and the Ateneo de Manila Hub for hosting and doing the heavy lifting to make this event possible and successful. And also to our co-organizers and co-sponsors, many thanks to the Climate System Analysis Group at the University of Cape Town, and also my colleagues at the MCR Education Working Group, and to Ted for giving us the welcoming remarks. Our gratitude to Ms. Edna Comia and Ms. Annalisa Regis Tolentino, our Filipino Sign Language interpreters, and also to Ivy Ferrer for handling the tech end, without which none of this would be possible. Also acknowledging the help of Isabella Movido and Julia Isabel Cruz, interns at AIS, who have been helping with the tech. So thank you to our facilitators as well, from the Ateneo de Manila Hub, Kendra, Daniel, Ian, Angel, Sophia, Ivy, from the Climate System Analysis Group, Lillian, Malatse, Christina, Tanya, from the Education Working Group, Celia, Suresh, and Tayaba. Thank you to our audience and workshop participants for your deep engagement. Let's carry on the work through the pathways that were indicated to us today. A quick note that the Education Working Group is planning 2 other events this year, so please stay tuned for an event in June hosted by the Himalayan University Consortium, and one that we are planning later this year. We'll disseminate the information as soon as it's final. I'm going to end with a quote from the Indian Nobel laureate poet and philosopher Rabindranath Tagore. The highest education is that which does not merely give us information, but that makes our life in harmony with all existence. So, to that noble end, in the face of the overwhelming odds the planet faces, I wish us all the courage and imagination and persistence that we need. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh, for bringing our program to a close. But at this point, may we request everyone to please turn on your cameras momentarily for our group photo. This will also serve as our documentation. Right? So I'll just give the rest of our colleagues a few more seconds to turn on their cameras. It's great to see everyone's smiling faces. Okay. All right, so I will be taking the screenshot in 3, 2, 1. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. It's great to see your smiling faces. I see some familiar faces here from our previous webinar series. So thank you very much for joining us. And at this point, as we bring our program to a close, we would like to ask our dear participants to please answer the evaluation survey with the QR code and link flashed on screen. Requests for e-certificates may be made through the same form. Thank you once again to everyone for being involved. Our tech team has also placed the link to our evaluation form in the chat. We hope that through your active participation in this webinar and workshop, you have gained fresh insights and are now able to better dissect the links between transdisciplinarity and colonialism, but also how we can move forward as a community. Please don't forget to accomplish our event evaluation form, and we will also share this form via email later on. Again, requests for e-certificates of participation will be coursed through the same form. Thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.